Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. There's a faded ring in the corner of the living room rug, perfectly round. The fibers there are flatter, paler, as if something had stood in place for a long time, something heavy. I've never placed anything there. I vacuumed the spot repeatedly, hoping it would fluff back up. It didn't. Then I noticed faint indentations in the center, shaped like toes. Not mine. Not human. Each morning, the circle seems slightly darker. I've started stepping over it entirely, as if disturbing it might invite something to return to its usual place. The first thing I did was check for leaks. Water damage could explain the discoloration, couldn't it? I ran my fingers along the ceiling above, pressed my ear to the wall, searching for the telltale sound of moisture creeping through wood and plaster. Nothing. The walls were dry, the ceiling intact. I even called maintenance, though I dreaded explaining the situation. The woman who came was thorough, professional. She examined every inch of that corner, took photos, made notes. Her conclusion was simple. No structural damage, no water. No reason for the carpet to wear in such a pattern. After she left, I measured the circle. Exactly 4 feet in diameter. The precision unsettled me more than the mystery itself. Natural wear doesn't create perfect geometry. I documented everything. Photographed the indentations, sketched the pattern, recorded the dimensions in a small notebook I kept by the window. The act of writing made it feel manageable, as if data could contain whatever was happening. The smell appeared on the 4th day. Sweet, cloying, like overripe fruit mixed with something medicinal. It emanated from the circle, but seemed to drift upward, pooling near the ceiling before settling back down. I opened every window, ran the air purifier constantly, but the scent persisted. It was strongest in the morning, fading throughout the day, until evening brought it back with renewed intensity. I began avoiding the living room after sunset. The circle seemed to pulse then, the worn fibers catching light differently than the rest of the rug. When I forced myself to look directly at it, my vision would blur slightly around the edges, as if my eyes were rejecting what they saw. The temperature in that corner dropped noticeably, not cold enough to see my breath, but enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. The recordings started accidentally. I'd been playing music while cleaning, my phone resting on the coffee table. Later, reviewing the audio for a song I'd forgotten, heard it, a low humming underneath the melody, rhythmic and deliberate. It wasn't coming from the speakers or the phone itself. The sound seemed to originate from the room, specifically from the direction of the circle. I set up my phone to record overnight, positioning it carefully to capture audio from that corner. The results were disturbing. Hours of silence, then sudden bursts of that same humming, sometimes accompanied by what sounded like shifting fabric or the soft scrape of something being dragged across carpet. The sounds never lasted more than a few minutes, but they occurred with eerie regularity, always in the deepest part of the night. Sleep became fractured. I'd wake to find myself standing in the living room, fully dressed, staring at the circle. The first time, I convinced myself I'd been sleepwalking, but it happened again and again until I began going to bed in my pajamas, specifically to test whether I was changing clothes unconsciously. I never was. Each time I found myself standing there, I was wearing the same outfit I'd fallen asleep in. Yet I had no memory of getting up, no recollection of walking to that room. The circle began to change shape. The perfect roundness elongated slightly, becoming oval, then distinctly egg-shaped. The indentations deepened, becoming more defined, more numerous. I could count them now. 7 distinct marks arranged in a pattern that made my stomach turn. They looked like footprints, but distorted, as if made by something that almost understood how to mimic human movement, but couldn't quite manage the anatomy. I stopped inviting people over. How could I explain the smell, the temperature change, the way the light seemed to bend around that corner? More importantly, how could I explain my own behavior? I'd catch myself talking to the circle, asking questions I couldn't remember forming, having conversations I couldn't recall starting. The notebook by the window filled with observations written in my handwriting that I didn't remember making. The breaking point came when I woke to find the circle occupied, not by a person or an object I could identify, but by a presence that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The worn carpet beneath appeared to ripple, as if something was pressing down from above, while simultaneously pulling upward from below. The air in the room felt thick, almost liquid, and every breath required conscious effort. I couldn't move, not from fear, but from a physical inability to command my muscles. I watched as the presence shifted, the darkness taking on a vaguely humanoid silhouette that towered above the furniture. It turned toward me. I felt its attention like a weight pressing against my chest, and I understood that it had been waiting for this moment, when I was awake enough to witness, but paralyzed enough to remain still. The humming filled the room, no longer confined to recordings or half-heard whispers. It vibrated through the floorboards, through my bones, settling into a rhythm that matched my heartbeat. The presence moved closer, and I could see that it wasn't walking so much as flowing, its form shifting between solid and vapor, never quite maintaining one state long enough for my mind to process. I tried to scream, but no sound emerged. The presence extended something that might have been an arm, might have been a tendril of shadow, and touched the top of my head. The contact was neither warm nor cold, but something between the two that made my skin feel like it was dissolving and reforming simultaneously. Images flooded my mind, not memories, but possibilities, futures where I became part of whatever pattern was being woven in that circle. Then it was gone. The room returned to normal temperature, the air cleared, and I could move again. But the circle had changed. It was larger now, encompassing nearly half the living room, and the indentations had multiplied, creating a complex mandala of footprints that spiraled inward toward the center. More disturbing still, some of the newer marks looked familiar. They matched the size and shape of my own feet. I packed a bag and left that day, but I couldn't escape the pattern. In the hotel room, I found myself tracing circles on the carpet with my toe. At work, I drew perfect rounds in the margins of documents. The compulsion followed me everywhere, as if something inside me was now synchronized with whatever force had claimed that corner of my living room. I've returned to the apartment only once to collect a few essential items. The circle now covers the entire living room floor, a complex web of worn fibers and indentations that pulse with their own rhythm. The sweet, medicinal smell has spread throughout the building. Other tenants have begun to complain about strange dreams, about waking up in places they don't remember going. I still carry the notebook, though I've stopped writing in it. The last entry, written in my handwriting, but not in my words, simply reads, "The pattern is spreading. The circle is complete. Now we begin the spiral." Sometimes, in the quiet moments between sleep and waking, I can feel the presence calling me back. Not to the apartment. I think it no longer needs that space, but to join the pattern that's expanding beyond any single location. The worn carpet was never about marking territory. It was about creating a doorway, and I was the key that opened it. The circle is wearing down everywhere now. I see it in subway stations, in office buildings, in the homes of strangers I pass on the street. Each one perfectly round, each one waiting for someone to step inside and complete the pattern. And I know, with a certainty that terrifies me more than any supernatural encounter, that eventually I will. The indentations in the center are calling me home. Story 2. I didn't notice it until I was on the phone. I said something untrue casually, and the door behind me released a soft creak, like a breath caught in metal. I turned. The door hadn't moved, but the sound continued, quiet and deliberate. I tried again, lying on purpose. Another sigh, different pitch. I've tested it since. Truth keeps the house quiet. Lies stir the air. Now I speak carefully, even to myself, because last night I whispered a lie under my breath, and the door didn't sigh, it groaned. The sound began as something I could almost ignore. A settling house, old wood responding to temperature changes. But houses don't learn your habits. Houses don't develop preferences for honesty. I started keeping notes. Small experiments. When I told my sister I was fine, the bathroom door exhaled softly. When I assured my colleague the report would be ready soon, knowing it wouldn't be, the bedroom door released a longer, more pronounced wheeze. The sounds were never quite the same, as if each lie carried its own signature frequency. The patterns emerged slowly. White lies produced gentle sighs. Deliberate deceptions created deeper groans. The worst sound came when I lied to myself, claiming I wasn't afraid of what was happening. That door, the one leading to the basement, made a sound like metal stretching, like hinges crying. I oil the hinges religiously now. It doesn't help. The sounds aren't mechanical. They're something else entirely. Something that lives in the space between truth and falsehood, feeding on the friction of dishonesty. The testing became compulsive. I would pace the house, speaking truths and lies in measured doses, mapping the responses. The front door remained silent when I spoke honestly about my day. But when I fabricated details, embellished stories, or softened harsh realities, it would sigh like a disappointed parent. I stopped having guests. How do you explain to someone that your house eavesdrops on conversations, that it judges the honesty of your words? How do you maintain normal social interactions when every pleasantry, every polite fiction, every social lubricant that makes human interaction bearable is met with architectural disapproval? The sounds grew more sophisticated. Different doors began specializing in different types of lies. The closet door seemed particularly sensitive to lies about appearance. When I claimed to like how I looked, it would creak with what sounded almost like mockery. The kitchen door responded to lies about food, about being hungry or full, about enjoying meals I forced myself to finish. I tried leaving, packed a bag, walked toward the front door, and announced to the empty house that I was going to visit a friend. The lie was reflexive, automatic. I had no friend to visit, nowhere to go. The door groaned so loudly I dropped my bag, items scattering across the floor. That's when I realized I wasn't just living with this phenomenon. I was trapped by it. The house began to teach me about the weight of truth. Every conversation became a minefield of potential dishonesty. I found myself speaking with mathematical precision, measuring each word for accuracy. But absolute honesty is a blade that cuts both ways. Relationships withered when I couldn't offer comforting lies, when I couldn't smooth social interactions with gentle deceptions. I started sleeping in the living room. The bedroom door had become too sensitive, responding to the lies I told myself in the dark, the false reassurances I whispered to make sleep possible. But even in the living room, I could hear the other doors throughout the house, a chorus of metallic breathing that rose and fell with the rhythm of my thoughts. The documentation became obsessive. I filled notebooks with observations, trying to map the logic of the phenomenon. Some lies went unnoticed. Others triggered immediate responses. The house seemed to learn to adapt, to become more discerning. It began to catch subtler forms of dishonesty, omissions, implications, the lies of silence. I tested the boundaries, wondering if the house could be fooled. I spoke technically true statements that carried false implications. The doors remained silent, but I could feel something gathering in the walls, a pressure building like storm clouds. The breaking point came when I tried to call for help. I dialed a number, any number, and when a voice answered, I began to explain. But how do you describe living with doors that judge your honesty without sounding insane? Every attempt to rationalize the situation, to make it palatable for outside consumption was met with a symphony of creaking disapproval. The house had trained me too well. I couldn't lie convincingly anymore, not even to save myself. I started eating less, speaking less, existing in a state of enforced honesty that felt like wearing skin too tight. The house rewarded my truthfulness with silence, but silence became its own form of torment. In the absence of the familiar sighs and groans, I found myself creating small lies just to hear the doors respond, to feel less alone in my architectural prison. The mirrors began to fog when I looked at them while lying. Not immediately, but gradually, as if the house was exhaling against the glass. My reflection would blur, becoming uncertain, as if even my appearance was subject to the house's judgment of truth. I began to understand that the house wasn't just responding to my lies. It was consuming them, growing stronger with each falsehood, each deception feeding something that lived in the spaces between the walls. The doors weren't just reacting, they were digesting. The final test came when I stood before the basement door, the one that made the worst sounds. I placed my hand on the wood and spoke the truest thing I could think of, that I was terrified, that I didn't understand what was happening, that I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The door remained silent, but the silence felt different now. Not empty, but full, pregnant with possibility. I turned the handle. The basement was exactly as I had left it, but the air tasted different, thicker, as if truth had weight, as if honesty had texture. I descended the stairs, each step accompanied by the sound of the door above me, creaking softly, rhythmically, like breathing. At the bottom, I found the source. A mirror, ancient and tarnished, mounted on the far wall. But the reflection wasn't mine. It showed the house from outside, from a perspective I had never seen, with every door standing open, exhaling visible breath into the night air. I reached toward the mirror, and my reflection reached back. Our fingers touched the glass from opposite sides, and in that moment, I understood. The house wasn't judging my lies. It was protecting something much more valuable. Something that lived in the space between truth and deception. Something that required the careful cultivation of honesty to survive. I climbed the stairs and closed the basement door behind me. It sighed once softly, like a contented animal. The other doors throughout the house joined in, a gentle chorus of mechanical breathing that no longer sounded like judgment. It sounded like welcome. Now I live with perfect honesty, and the house lives with me. We have reached an understanding. I feed it truth, and it protects me from the lies I might tell myself. The doors still sigh when I lie, but I lie so rarely now that the sound has become precious, a reminder of the person I used to be. Sometimes I catch myself about to say something untrue, and I pause, feeling the house hold its breath around me. In those moments, I remember that some prisons are sanctuaries, and some truths are worth the price of freedom. The door hinges sigh when I lie, but they sing when I tell the truth. Story 3. It happened by accident. I knocked the frame sideways while dusting. Behind it, the paint was intact, but the wall felt different, warmer, subtly pliable. I pressed gently, and it gave slightly, like thick skin. I removed the frame entirely. The surface there was smoother than the rest of the wall, like it had been stretched over something hollow. I haven't touched it since, but sometimes, when I walk by, the frame is just a bit crooked, like something behind it shifted. The apartment has been my home for 3 years now. Every corner familiar, every sound cataloged in my memory. The radiator's metallic clicks, the neighbor's television bleeding through thin walls, the way floorboards respond to my footsteps. But that patch of wall has become something else entirely. Something that doesn't belong in my carefully ordered world. I started documenting it on the second day. The frame had moved again, not dramatically, just enough to notice. A slight tilt to the right, casting shadows that hadn't been there before. I straightened it, made a mental note, continued with my routine. But my fingers lingered on the glass, and I found myself staring at the wall's reflection, searching for irregularities that hadn't existed before. The warmth was the first thing I couldn't rationalize, while the rest of the apartment carried the typical chill of old buildings. That specific area radiated a gentle heat. Not electric, not mechanical, something organic. I pressed my palm against it again, held it there longer this time. The surface yielded under pressure, creating a shallow depression that slowly filled back out when I pulled away. I started keeping a journal. Simple observations at first. Temperature variations. The way light fell differently across that section. How dust seemed to avoid settling there, as if something beneath was creating the faintest current of air. The notes became more detailed as days passed. Measurements taken with a ruler showed the wall was slightly convex now, bulging outward by mere millimeters. Sleep became elusive. Not because of fear, I'm not easily frightened, but because of curiosity. The kind that burrows into your thoughts and refuses to leave. I found myself checking the wall multiple times each night, running my hands across its surface, feeling for changes. The warmth was constant now, and the texture had evolved. What once felt like stretched skin now resembled something more pliable, more responsive. The frame started moving more frequently. I would straighten it before leaving for work, return to find it askew. Sometimes tilted left, sometimes right, occasionally hanging at angles that defied the nail's position. I began marking its placement with small pieces of tape, creating reference points. The frame moved regardless, as if something behind it was expanding and contracting rhythmically. I installed a small camera aimed at the wall. The footage showed nothing during daylight hours, just static frames hanging motionless. But reviewing the overnight recordings revealed subtle movements. The wall's surface rippling almost imperceptibly, like water disturbed by something moving beneath. The frame responding to these movements, shifting position gradually over several hours. The sounds started during the third week. Soft at first, a whisper of movement behind drywall. I pressed my ear against the warm section, holding my breath to listen more carefully. There was something there, not mechanical, not structural settling. Something rhythmic, something that paused when I moved away and resumed when I returned. I began tapping the wall systematically, mapping the hollow space behind. The sound was different across the warm section, deeper, more resonant, like tapping on a drum with something soft inside. The boundaries of this hollow space were expanding. What had initially been limited to the area behind the frame now stretched several inches in every direction. The smell appeared gradually, subtle and organic, like earth after rain, but with an underlying sweetness that made my mouth water despite myself. It was strongest near the wall, dissipating as I moved away. I couldn't identify it completely, something between flowers and decay, between growing things and things that had stopped growing. My research became obsessive. I measured the wall's temperature hourly, documented its texture changes, recorded the sounds with increasingly sensitive equipment. The data painted a picture I couldn't accept. Something was alive behind my wall. Something that was growing. The frame fell one night while I slept. I woke to the sound of glass breaking, rushed to investigate. The wall had bulged outward significantly, pushing the frame's nail beyond its anchor point. The surface was no longer warm. It was hot to the touch, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. The hollow sound had become a resonance, as if the space behind was much larger than physically possible. I called building maintenance. The superintendent arrived with tools and skepticism that transformed into confusion as he examined the wall. He couldn't explain the temperature, the texture, the way his stud finder gave inconsistent readings. We agreed to open it up to see what was causing the anomaly. The first cut revealed something impossible. Behind the drywall wasn't insulation or empty space. It was a membrane. Thick, translucent, stretched taut across a cavity that extended far beyond the wall's supposed depth. The membrane pulsed gently, and through it, I could see movement. Shapes shifting in fluid, pressing against the barrier from within. The superintendent left immediately. I don't blame him. What we'd found violated every principle of architecture and biology. But I couldn't leave it alone. The membrane fascinated me. The way it responded to touch, growing warmer and more active when I pressed against it. The shapes inside became more defined, more purposeful in their movements. I spent hours studying it, taking photographs, collecting samples from its surface. The membrane seemed to be growing, spreading beyond the original opening. Each day brought new expansion, new areas of the wall becoming warm and pliable. The apartment itself was changing, adapting to accommodate whatever was developing behind its surfaces. The breakthrough came when I realized I wasn't just observing anymore. I was participating. The membrane had begun responding to my presence differently. When I approached, it would thin in certain areas, allowing clearer views of what lay beneath. The shapes inside had become more organized, more focused. They were aware of me, just as I had become aware of them. I started communicating through touch. Gentle pressure against the membrane would provoke responses, pulses, movements, changes in temperature. A language was developing between us, crude but effective. I could ask questions through patterns of touch and receive answers through the membrane's reactions. What I learned changed everything. The wall wasn't harboring something foreign, it was evolving. The apartment itself was becoming something new, something more complex. The membrane was just the beginning, a doorway to a transformation that had been waiting for the right catalyst. For someone to notice, to investigate, to engage. I am that catalyst. My curiosity, my documentation, my willingness to touch and explore. These actions have accelerated the process. The wall behind the picture frame was soft because it was preparing, growing, changing from simple barrier to something more permeable, more alive. The frame sits on my table now, glass replaced, waiting. The wall it once hung on is completely transformed, warm, responsive, covered in a membrane that breathes with its own rhythm. Other areas of the apartment are beginning to show similar changes. The bathroom wall feels different when I shower. The kitchen counter has developed a subtle give under pressure. I document everything, but I know my observations are incomplete. I'm no longer just studying the phenomenon, I'm part of it. The membrane responds to my biorhythms, my emotional state, my physical presence. We're becoming integrated, the apartment and I, evolving together into something neither of us was before. The process is accelerating. Each day brings new developments, new areas of transformation. I wonder sometimes if I should be afraid, if I should seek help or attempt to reverse what's happening. But curiosity outweighs caution. This is discovery on a scale I never imagined possible. The wall behind the picture frame feels soft because it's becoming something new. Something that was always meant to be. And I'm becoming part of that transformation, whether I understand it or not. The frame hangs crooked now because there's no longer a solid wall to support it, just a membrane breathing quietly, waiting for whatever comes next. Story 4. It has its usual rhythm, a low buzz, nothing unusual. But when I get anxious, it responds. The hum thickens like it's tuning in. I tried ignoring it, but the tone followed me around the kitchen, subtle but aware. One night, after a nightmare, I walked past, and the motor groaned sharply, as if scolding. Since then, I only open the door when I feel calm. I think it can smell fear, or maybe it feeds on it. The first time I truly noticed the connection, I was standing barefoot on the cold linoleum, holding a glass of water that trembled against my lips. My hands were shaking from the stress of another sleepless night, and behind me, the refrigerator's hum grew deeper, more pronounced. Not louder exactly, but richer, like a voice finding its register. I turned around and stared at the white metal door, watching the soft blue glow of the LED strip underneath cast shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I placed my palm against the surface, expecting the usual cool smoothness. Instead, I felt a barely perceptible vibration, like a cat's purr traveling through the metal. The sensation traveled up my arm, and I jerked my hand back. The humming stopped completely. The kitchen fell into an unnatural silence that made my ears ring. Over the following days, I began to test this strange relationship. When I felt calm, cooking breakfast or reading in the nearby chair, the appliance maintained its normal background murmur. But during phone calls with difficult relatives, or while paying bills, the sound would swell and warp, becoming almost melodic. I started keeping a small notebook, documenting these episodes with the careful precision of a scientist studying an unknown phenomenon. The entries began simply: Tuesday argument with landlord. Hum became rhythmic, almost like drumming. But as weeks passed, the observations grew more unsettling. The vibration traveled through the floorboards today. I could feel it in my feet, even from the living room. And later, found condensation on the outside of the door, even though the room temperature hasn't changed. I discovered that the machine responded not just to my anxiety, but to the specific flavors of my distress. Financial worry produced a steady drone, while loneliness created a higher pitch that seemed to call out. Social embarrassment triggered rapid pulses, like an electronic heartbeat. I began to wonder if other appliances in the building were similarly aware. But testing this theory felt too dangerous. The first truly disturbing incident happened during a particularly stressful week. I was pacing the kitchen, rehearsing an important conversation in my head, when I noticed the humming had synchronized with my footsteps. I stopped walking. The sound continued for exactly 3 more beats, then fell silent. I took a step forward. The hum resumed, matching my pace perfectly. I ran to the far corner of the apartment, but could still hear it, maintaining our shared rhythm despite the distance. That night, I decided to record everything. I set up my phone near the appliance and spoke directly to it, describing my fears and anxieties while documenting the audio response. Playing back the recording later, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Underneath my voice, woven into the mechanical drone, were fragments of whispered words. Not quite human, but not entirely machine either. The sounds seemed to be trying to form phrases, to communicate something urgent and incomprehensible. I became obsessed with decoding these messages. I recorded hours of audio, analyzing the patterns, looking for meaning in the electrical symphony. The whispers grew clearer, more insistent. They spoke of hunger, of connection, of a need to understand the warm, rushing thing that lived inside me. I realized the machine wasn't just responding to my emotions. It was learning from them, feeding on them, becoming something more than the sum of its parts. The breaking point came when I tried to silence it completely. I unplugged the unit, thinking I could end this strange partnership. But the humming continued, now coming from the walls themselves, from the electrical wiring that snaked behind the plaster. The sound had spread throughout the building's nervous system, carried by copper veins to every room, every outlet, every switch. I plugged the refrigerator back in, and the humming returned to its familiar location. But something had changed. The tone was different now, more complex, layered with harmonics that seemed to resonate in my bones. When I approached the door, I could see my reflection in the white surface, but it was wrong somehow. The reflection moved a fraction of a second behind my actual movements, as if it was thinking before copying me. I stopped eating food from inside the unit. The contents had begun to taste metallic, charged with an energy that made my teeth ache. I survived on takeout and restaurant meals, but the machine's presence grew stronger, more demanding. It had tasted my fear, my loneliness, my desperate need for connection. And now it wanted more. Now, as I write this, the humming has evolved into something that sounds almost like singing. A low, electronic lullaby that follows me from room to room, seeping through the walls like a virus in the building's bloodstream. I've stopped trying to understand it, stopped trying to document its behavior. Understanding was never the point. The machine doesn't want to be understood. It wants to be fed. And every time I feel that familiar spike of anxiety, every time my heart rate increases and my palms grow damp, I hear it responding from the kitchen, growing stronger, more alive, more hungry for whatever it is that makes me human. I think it's learning to love me in its own way, and I'm terrified of what that might mean. Story 5. I live alone. I clean often. But every so often, a thin layer of dust appears in the hallway, and something has disturbed it. Careful, deliberate lines, footsteps, not from a breeze, like dragging fingers without weight. Once they formed a spiral, another time a grid. I erased them with a cloth, but the next day they returned, more intricate. I stopped cleaning them. I started taking photos, but in every photo, the patterns blur, as if whatever made them doesn't want to be documented, only acknowledged. The house breathes differently when I find them. The air feels thicker, charged with something I can't name. The floorboards creak in unfamiliar rhythms, and the walls seem to lean inward, as if listening. I run my fingers along the patterns, feeling the fine particles shift beneath my touch. They're warm. Dust shouldn't be warm. I began documenting everything in a notebook. Each pattern, each location, each subtle change in the house's behavior. The shapes appear most frequently during the quiet hours when shadows stretch longest across the hallway. Sometimes they're geometric, perfect hexagons, interlocking triangles. Other times they're organic, flowing like water frozen mid-motion, but always precise, always intentional. My neighbor mentioned the scent of vanilla drifting from my house. I don't use vanilla anything. The smell appears when the patterns are fresh, sweet, and cloying, mixing with the mustiness of old wood and settling dust. It lingers in my clothes, my hair, my dreams. I wake to find it stronger some mornings, as if something has been breathing vanilla into my lungs while I sleep. The patterns began appearing in other rooms. Kitchen tiles disturbed in perfect spirals. Bathroom mirror fogged despite the dry air, revealing symbols I couldn't read before they faded. I cleaned frantically, but they returned within hours, more elaborate than before. The house was learning, adapting, becoming something else entirely while I lived inside it. I installed motion sensors. They detected nothing. Security cameras showed empty hallways, undisturbed dust. But when I checked the footage, I could see the patterns had changed between frames. One moment, a simple line. The next, a complex mandala. The cameras were blind to whatever created them, but not to their existence. The sounds started subtle. A whisper in the radiator pipes that almost sounded like words. Static from the radio when it wasn't turned on. The refrigerator humming melodies I'd never heard, but somehow recognized. I recorded everything on my phone, but playback revealed only silence, punctuated by my own breathing, growing more ragged with each passing day. My hands began shaking, not from fear, but from something deeper: recognition. The patterns weren't random. They were responding to me, to my presence, to my growing understanding that I was no longer alone in this house. The dust knew I was watching. It wanted to be seen. I stopped leaving. Food deliveries came to the door, but I couldn't bring myself to cross the threshold. The patterns had spread to the entryway, creating a barrier of intricate designs that pulsed with their own rhythm. When I stepped near them, the house exhaled a long, satisfied sound that made my teeth ache. The temperature fluctuated wildly. Ice-cold patches in the hallway where the patterns were thickest. Scorching heat radiating from the walls where the dust had been disturbed. I pressed my palms against the surfaces, feeling them vibrate with an energy that made my vision blur. The house was alive, and I was inside its belly. I tried to break the patterns, swept them away with violent strokes, mopped the floors with bleach, even rearranged the furniture. But they returned within hours, more complex, more beautiful, more demanding. The house punished my interference with sounds, scratching inside the walls, footsteps in the attic, doors slamming in empty rooms. The dust began forming words, not in any language I recognized, but I understood their meaning in my bones. They spoke of patience, of waiting, of someone who had been expected for a very long time. The patterns weren't random art. They were a conversation, and I was finally learning to listen. My reflection started changing. In mirrors, windows, any reflective surface, my face appeared different, older, more knowing, wearing expressions I'd never made. The dust patterns mirrored these changes, becoming more human-like, more personal. They knew me better than I knew myself. The house no longer felt like mine. I was a guest, a visitor in a space that had been waiting for me to arrive. The patterns guided me now, leading me from room to room, showing me hidden corners I'd never noticed. Behind the wallpaper, scratches in the wood spelled out names I couldn't pronounce. Under the floorboards, objects wrapped in cloth that crumbled when touched. I found the previous owner's journal wedged behind the water heater. The pages were filled with sketches, the same patterns I'd been documenting, drawn in increasingly frantic lines. The final entry was just one word repeated across the entire page: ready. The handwriting changed partway through, becoming neater, more controlled. Not human anymore. The patterns now cover every surface. flow across walls like living things, shifting when I'm not looking directly at them. The house breathes in rhythm with my heartbeat, and I realize I'm no longer fighting the presence here. I'm becoming part of it. I don't clean anymore. I don't document. I simply exist within the patterns, watching them grow more complex, more beautiful, more demanding. They're teaching me something important, something I need to understand before I can leave. But I'm beginning to suspect I was never meant to leave at all. The dust forms shapes I don't remember making. But perhaps I did make them in another life, in another form. Perhaps I've been here all along, waiting for myself to come home. Story 6. I've never alphabetized it. No system. But every time I'm upset, one specific book moves slightly, tilts out, just enough to be noticeable. Different book each time. Once I opened one. The passage I landed on described the exact thing I was feeling. Since then, I've tried to outsmart it, move the books myself, swap them around. Still, it finds a way. The shelf knows, or something behind it does. It's not helping me. It's studying me. The first time I noticed, rain was drumming against the windows with that hollow sound that makes empty rooms feel smaller. I'd been staring at the rejection letter for what felt like hours, the words blurring together, until they became nothing but black shapes on cream paper. My chest felt tight, that familiar weight pressing down like someone had placed stones there while I wasn't looking. That's when I saw it. A thin blue spine, third shelf from the bottom, leaning out at an angle that hadn't been there before. The book looked worn, its edges soft from handling, though I couldn't remember the last time I touched it. Something about the way it sat there, askew among its perfectly aligned neighbors, made my skin prickle. I approached slowly, the floorboards creaking beneath my bare feet. The book felt warm when I pulled it free, warmer than it should have been considering the draft that always seemed to seep through the walls. I opened it randomly, letting the pages fall where they would. The words hit me like cold water. A passage about professional disappointment, about the crushing weight of unfulfilled potential, about sitting in a room full of books and feeling like a fraud among real writers. Every sentence could have been pulled directly from my thoughts, written in my own internal voice, but with a clarity I'd never managed to achieve. I slammed the book shut, my hands trembling slightly. Coincidence? Had to be. I'd probably read this passage years ago, forgotten about it, and my subconscious had simply retained the emotional imprint. The mind plays tricks when you're vulnerable, but the book continued to lean out whenever I felt that particular brand of despair. Not other emotions, not anger or loneliness, or even deeper sadness. Just that specific cocktail of professional inadequacy and creative paralysis. And always, when I opened it, the pages would reveal something that matched my internal state with unsettling precision. I started keeping a journal, documenting each incident. The pattern became impossible to ignore. Different books, different emotions, but always the same subtle displacement. A cookbook when I felt isolated from family traditions. A philosophy text when I questioned my place in the world. A memoir when grief sat heavy in my chest. The smell started around the same time I began my documentation. Sweet at first, like vanilla and old paper, but with an undertone that reminded me of something medicinal. It would appear without warning, strongest near the bookshelf, fading as I moved away. I checked for mold, for dead mice, for any logical explanation. Nothing. I decided to test it. I rearranged the entire collection, creating deliberate chaos where there had been organic disorder. Historical biographies mixed with science fiction, poetry pressed between cookbooks, children's stories shelved next to dense philosophical treatises. I photographed everything, creating a detailed record of each book's position. The next morning, experiencing a familiar pang of anxiety about an upcoming family gathering, I found a slim volume of social psychology protruding from the third shelf. It hadn't been there before. According to my photographs, it had been on the top shelf, wedged between two mystery novels. Yet here it was, perfectly positioned for my notice, its pages already falling open to a chapter about the performance of normalcy in social situations. My hands shook as I checked the photographs again. The book was clearly visible in its original position, spine straight, showing no signs of the slight forward lean that had become so familiar. But the timestamp on the photo was from yesterday evening, and I was certain I hadn't moved anything since then. I started sleeping in the living room, positioning myself where I could see the shelf throughout the night. The first few nights yielded nothing but the usual sounds of a settling house, creaks and sighs that I'd learned to ignore over the years. But on the fourth night, during that thin hour between sleep and waking. I heard it, a soft whisper like pages turning. Not the crisp sound of paper against paper, but something more organic, more breath-like. I kept my eyes closed, focusing on the sound, trying to pinpoint its source. It seemed to come from behind the books themselves, from the wall, as if something was moving within the space between the shelves and the plaster. When I finally opened my eyes, a thick volume of dream analysis was leaning outward, its burgundy cover catching the street light that filtered through the curtains. I'd been dreaming about drowning, about being pulled under by hands I couldn't see, and I knew without looking that the book would have something to say about water symbolism and the subconscious mind. I didn't get up to check. Instead, I lay there watching the shelf, waiting for movement, for any sign of how the books were changing position. But the shadows remained still, and eventually, exhaustion pulled me back into uneasy sleep. The next phase began when I tried to remove the books entirely. I packed them all into boxes, stacking them in the basement, leaving the shelves bare except for a few decorative objects: a small ceramic vase, a framed photograph, a wooden box that had belonged to my grandmother. The room felt hollow without them, like a mouth with its teeth removed. For 3 days, nothing happened. I began to feel foolish, convinced I'd been manufacturing mystery where none existed. But on the 4th day, I found the wooden box open, its contents scattered across the shelf. Inside had been letters, old photographs, small mementos from various stages of my life. Now they were arranged in a pattern I couldn't decipher, overlapping and positioned with a precision that felt intentional. At the center lay a photograph I didn't remember saving, a picture of myself as a child, standing in a library, reaching for a book on a high shelf. My face was turned away from the camera, but something about the posture, the way my small hand stretched toward the spine, filled me with unease. The photograph felt wrong somehow, like it belonged to someone else's childhood. I gathered everything back into the box, closing it firmly. But the next morning found it open again. This time, a different photograph had been placed at the center. Another library scene, but older, sepia-toned, showing a child who might have been me, but whose face was obscured by shadows. The clothes were wrong for the period, though too modern for the photograph's apparent age. The smell had grown stronger, no longer sweet but acrid, like burning electrical wiring. followed me through the house now, not confined to the living room. I would catch it in the kitchen while making coffee, in the bedroom while folding laundry, always strongest when I was feeling that particular combination of confusion and growing dread. I brought the books back up from the basement, unable to tolerate the empty shelves any longer. As I unpacked them, I noticed something I'd missed before. Small marks on the wall behind where they'd been shelved. Not scratches, but impressions, as if something had been pressing against the plaster from behind. The marks formed no recognizable pattern, just a series of curved lines that seemed to follow the contours of the shelves themselves. That night, I heard voices. Not the whispered page-turning sounds from before, but actual voices, muffled and indistinct, coming from behind the wall. I pressed my ear against the plaster, but the sound seemed to retreat, moving deeper into the structure of the house. When I pulled away, the voices stopped entirely. I began to understand that whatever was happening wasn't random. It was responsive, interactive, adapting to my attempts to study it. The more I tried to document and control the phenomenon, the more it seemed to escalate, as if my attention was feeding it somehow. The books now moved during the day while I was watching. Not dramatic shifts, but subtle adjustments, a spine rotating slightly, a volume settling deeper into its position, small changes that I might have missed if I hadn't been looking so carefully. The movement was almost organic, like breathing. I tried talking to it. Sitting in front of the bookshelf, I spoke aloud, asking questions, requesting explanations. The responses came through the books themselves, passages that seemed to answer my queries, but in ways that raised more questions than they resolved. It was like having a conversation with something that understood my language, but spoke in riddles. The final escalation came when I decided to move out entirely. I couldn't continue living with the growing sense that I was being observed, studied, cataloged like one of the books on the shelf. I packed my belongings, arranged for a storage unit, prepared to leave the house and its mysterious resident behind. But as I loaded the last box into my car, I realized I'd forgotten something. The feeling was overwhelming, urgent, though I couldn't identify what I'd left behind. I returned to the house, walking through the empty rooms, trying to understand what was drawing me back. The bookshelf was full again, not with my books, but with volumes I didn't recognize, their spines labeled with symbols instead of words. They seemed to pulse with their own light, casting shadows that moved independently of any external source. And at the center of the middle shelf, leaning out at that familiar angle, was a book that bore my name on its cover. I opened it with trembling hands. The pages were blank except for a single line written in my own handwriting. The shelf knows, or something behind it does. It's not helping me. It's studying me. I don't remember writing those words, but I recognized the truth in them. I closed the book, placed it back on the shelf, and left the house. I never returned, but I dream about it sometimes, about the books rearranging themselves in the dark, about the thing behind the wall that watches and waits and learns. And sometimes, in whatever library or bookstore I find myself in, I catch that medicinal smell and notice a book leaning out from its shelf, waiting for me to discover what it wants to teach me next. Story 7. I catch it in moments, just flashes, when I look up too quickly or lean in too far. My face in the mirror holds an emotion I don't feel. Disgust, amusement, hunger, just for a second. I tried filming it, but the recordings are always blank during those moments. A gray static replaces my reflection. I've stopped brushing my teeth in front of it, but now I see handprints forming in the steam. 5 fingers, longer than mine, pulling downward, like something inside is trying to escape or enter. The bathroom has become my laboratory. I've started keeping a journal, documenting every anomaly with the precision of a scientist. Entry after entry, I record the temperature changes, the way the mirror seems to pull heat from the air around it. Even on the warmest days, condensation forms in patterns that shouldn't exist. Spirals, geometric shapes, words I can't quite read before they fade. The smell started 3 weeks ago. Sweet copper, like pennies left in milk. It's strongest near the mirror, weakening as I move toward the door. I've checked the pipes, the ventilation, even pulled apart the medicine cabinet. Nothing. The scent seems to seep from the glass itself, as if something on the other side is breathing against it. I've become obsessed with peripheral vision. That's when I see it clearest, the wrongness in my reflection. While staring straight ahead, I'll catch movement in the corner of my eye. My mouth opening when my lips are sealed. My hand rising when both arms hang at my sides. The reflection moves with a delay, like like a bad satellite connection between my body and the glass. Last week, I installed a motion sensor light. Scientific approach, eliminate variables. But the light flickers in patterns that don't match my movements. 3 short pulses, 2 long ones. It repeats every few minutes, as if something is trying to communicate in a code I don't understand. I've written down the sequences, pages of dots and dashes that spell nothing in any language I know. The handprints are getting clearer, not just in steam now, but pressed into the glass itself. I can trace their outline with my fingertip, ridges and valleys that shouldn't exist on a smooth surface. They're cold to the touch, several degrees below the surrounding mirror. I've measured, I've documented, I've photographed everything except what matters most. My reflection has started moving first. I'll reach for the faucet, and the figure in the mirror will begin the motion a split second before I do. It's learning, anticipating. The delay that once made it seem broken now makes it appear prescient, as if it knows what I'm going to do before I decide to do it, as if it's not reflecting my actions, but predicting them. The whispers began when I started sleeping in the living room. Faint electrical hums from the bathroom, like voices filtered through old radio static. I've recorded hours of it, played it back at different speeds, adjusted the frequency. Sometimes I think I hear my name. Sometimes I think I hear instructions. But when I lean closer to the speakers, the sound becomes nothing more than white noise. I can't avoid the bathroom forever. Basic human needs force me back, always with my eyes down, focusing on the sink, the floor, anywhere but the mirror. But I feel it watching. The presence behind the glass has weight now, substance. The air grows thick when I enter, like walking through invisible cobwebs. Today I made a mistake. I looked up. My reflection was smiling. Not the subtle wrong expression from before, but a wide, deliberate grin that stretched too far across my face. I wasn't smiling. I was terrified. But the thing in the mirror looked delighted, as if it had been waiting for this moment of direct contact. I stumbled backward, hitting the door frame. And when I looked again, my reflection was normal, except for the eyes. They remained fixed on mine even as I moved, tracking my movement with the focus of a predator. The smile was gone, but something worse had replaced it. Recognition. As if it finally understood that I could see it clearly. I've covered the mirror with a towel. cloth sags in the center, as if something is pressing against it from behind. The handprints appear through the fabric now, 5 long fingers stretching the terry cotton into grotesque shapes. I can hear tapping from underneath, patient and rhythmic. Morse code spelled out in fingertips against glass. The worst part is the dreams. I'm standing in a bathroom that's identical to mine, but reversed. Everything is backward, the faucets, the tiles, even the text on the bottles. And I'm looking at a mirror that shows my real bathroom, where another version of myself is sleeping peacefully, unaware that something else is wearing his face. I wake up with the taste of copper in my mouth. The towel fell down this morning. Not pulled, it simply dropped, as if gravity had suddenly increased around the mirror. And what I saw wasn't my reflection anymore. It was something wearing my appearance like an ill-fitting mask, studying me with the patience of something that has existed far longer than I have. I tried to leave the apartment, but the door won't open. The lock turns, the handle moves, but the door remains sealed as if the frame has fused with the wall. Windows too. I'm trapped with whatever is learning to be me, perfecting its mimicry, one expression at a time. The handprints are on this side of the mirror now. Story 8. I thought it was neighbors at first, muffled conversations late at night. But the words are in no language I recognize. Soft, breathy syllables with pauses too long to be casual. I put my ear closer and the voices stop. Not abruptly, intentionally. Like they know I'm listening. One night, I whispered into the vent. No response. But in the morning, something new was wedged inside. A pebble, smooth and warm. I left it on the counter. It disappeared by the next day. The apartment feels different now. The walls seem to breathe with a rhythm that doesn't match my own heartbeat. I press my palm against the cool surface and feel the faintest vibration, like a cat's purr trapped beneath layers of paint and plaster. The texture is rougher than I remember, almost grainy, as if microscopic particles are shifting constantly under my touch. I've started keeping a journal, not because I'm losing my mind, but because the details matter. The voices always begin with a low humming sound, like electricity running through old wires. Then comes the whispering, syllables that rise and fall in patterns too complex for random noise. Sometimes I catch fragments that sound almost familiar, like words I knew once, but forgot. The smell hits me first when I walk through the front door. It's not unpleasant, just wrong, sweet and metallic, like copper pennies soaked in honey. It's strongest near the kitchen, where the main vent hangs open like a mouth. I've checked the filters, cleaned the ducts as far as I can reach, but the scent persists. It's getting stronger. I bought a small recording device, digital, sensitive enough to pick up sounds I might miss. I leave it running all night, positioned directly beneath the vent. The first recording is mostly silence, punctuated by the building's natural settling sounds. But there's something else, a soft scratching, like fingernails on fabric. It stops and starts in intervals, never quite forming a recognizable pattern. The second recording is different. The scratching is there, but underneath it, I can hear breathing. Not the mechanical wheeze of air conditioning, but actual respiration. Slow, deliberate inhales and exhales that don't match my sleeping patterns. I check the timestamp. The breathing continues for nearly an hour while I was supposedly unconscious. I start talking to the vent during the day. Casual conversation, as if I'm speaking to a shy neighbor. I tell it about my work, my morning coffee, the weather outside my window. Nothing happens for several days. Then, one afternoon, I hear a soft click from inside the ductwork, like a tongue against teeth. I freeze mid-sentence, waiting. The click repeats, then stops. The pebbles multiply. Not just one anymore, but small collections that appear in different locations. On the windowsill, beside the bathroom sink, tucked between couch cushions. They're all smooth, all warm to the touch, all the same pale gray color. I line them up on the kitchen counter, counting them obsessively. 7, then 9, then 12. They seem to migrate when I'm not looking. I wake up one morning to find words written on the bathroom mirror. Not in condensation or dust, but somehow etched into the glass itself. The letters are thin, precise, almost surgical in their formation. They spell out a single word in a language I don't recognize, though the shape of it feels familiar on my tongue when I try to pronounce it. The voices are getting clearer. What I initially dismissed as random syllables now seems to follow grammatical rules. There are repeated phrases, vocal inflections that suggest questions and answers. I'm beginning to understand the rhythm, even if the meaning remains opaque. It's like listening to a conversation in a room next door, where the words are muffled, but the emotional undertones bleed through. I decide to respond more directly. I write notes on small pieces of paper and feed them into the vent opening. Simple messages. Who are you? And what do you want? The papers disappear immediately, sucked into the darkness beyond my reach. I wait for a response, but nothing comes. Not that night or the next. Then I find the photograph. It's tucked partially under my pillow, as if someone placed it there while I slept. The image is grainy, taken from an unusual angle. It shows my apartment, but the perspective is wrong. The furniture is in the same positions, but everything looks slightly larger, as if viewed from a much lower vantage point. The most disturbing part is the figure in the corner, a shadow that might be human, crouched near the vent opening. I examine the photo with a magnifying glass. The shadow has definition, weight. It's not a trick of lighting or a double exposure. Someone or something was in my apartment when this picture was taken. The timestamp in the corner shows yesterday's date, but I don't remember taking any photographs. The temperature drops, not gradually, but in distinct pockets throughout the apartment. I'll walk from the bedroom to the kitchen and pass through invisible barriers of cold air. The sensation is so sharp that I can map the boundaries precisely. They form a pattern that connects the various vents, creating pathways of chill that pulse with their own internal logic. I start leaving the recording device in different rooms. The sounds change depending on location. In the bedroom, I capture soft scraping noises, like fabric being dragged across metal. In the living room, there's a rhythmic tapping that could be footsteps, or could be something else entirely. The kitchen recordings are the most disturbing. They contain what sounds like chewing, slow and deliberate, as if something is consuming materials I can't identify. The breakthrough comes when I play the recordings backward. The seemingly random sounds resolve into something that approaches coherence. Not words exactly, but patterns that suggest meaning. The breathing becomes more regular. The scratching forms recognizable sequences. It's as if the communications are being transmitted in reverse, requiring me to decode them properly. I try speaking backward into the vent, reversing my sentences phonetically. The response is immediate. A soft thud from deep within the ductwork, followed by a series of clicks that sound almost like applause. I've made contact. The realization should be exciting, but instead I feel a creeping dread that settles in my chest like cold water. The photographs multiply. I find them everywhere now, tucked into books, taped to the inside of cabinet doors, slipped between clean sheets. They all show my apartment from impossible angles, as if taken by someone who can move through spaces too small for human bodies. In some images, I can see myself sleeping, cooking, reading, always unaware of the observer. The last photograph is different. It shows my face, but the expression is wrong. My eyes are too wide, my mouth slightly open, as if I'm about to speak or scream. I don't remember making that expression. I've never seen myself look that way. But the image is undeniably me, taken from mere inches away while I was apparently unconscious. I wake up to find the vent cover removed. It lies on the floor beside my bed, the screws neatly arranged in a small pile. The opening yawns above me like a wound in the ceiling. I can see deeper into the ductwork than ever before, but the darkness beyond reveals nothing. I replace the cover immediately, but my hands shake as I work the screws back into place. The voices are speaking in unison now. Multiple speakers, their words overlapping in harmonious discord. The sound is hypnotic, almost musical. I find myself sitting beneath the vent for hours, listening to the incomprehensible chorus. My journal entries become shorter, less coherent. I'm forgetting to eat, forgetting to sleep. The voices are becoming more important than my own thoughts. I try to leave the apartment, but the door won't open. The lock turns, the deadbolt slides, but the door remains sealed as if welded shut. The windows are the same functional latches, movable frames, but an invisible barrier prevents them from opening. I'm not trapped in any conventional sense, but I'm definitely contained. The pebbles have arranged themselves into a pattern on the kitchen counter, a spiral that draws the eye inward toward a center point that seems to extend beyond the surface of the counter itself. I try to disturb the arrangement, but the stones feel fixed in place, as if they've grown roots into the laminate below. When I apply pressure, they warm under my touch, almost burning. I speak to the vent constantly now. I tell it about my growing fear, my confusion, my desperate need for answers. The responses come more frequently, clicks, scratches, soft exhalations that might be laughter. Sometimes I hear my own voice echoing back, but the words are subtly different, as if filtered through a consciousness that doesn't quite understand human speech. The mirror writing changes daily. New words appear, always in that same surgical script. I've started copying them into my journal, though I can't pronounce most of them. The shapes seem to shift when I'm not looking directly at them, the letters rearranging themselves into configurations that hurt to read. I cover the mirror with a towel, but the writing appears on other reflective surfaces: the coffee pot, the window glass, the screen of my phone. The final recording is the longest. Nearly 6 hours of continuous sound, captured during what I thought was a peaceful night's sleep. But the audio reveals something else entirely. I can hear myself talking, though I have no memory of speaking. My voice is calm, conversational, as if I'm having a pleasant chat with an old friend. I'm answering questions I can't hear, responding to prompts that exist only in the spaces between words. The conversation continues until dawn. My voice grows hoarse, then stronger, as if the act of speaking is somehow nourishing me. Toward the end, I can hear other voices joining in, not the whispers from the vent, but human voices, speaking in languages I don't recognize, but somehow understand. We're all talking at once, creating a symphony of communication that transcends normal linguistic boundaries. When I wake up, my throat is raw and my mouth tastes of copper. There's a new photograph on the nightstand. It shows the inside of the vent system, but from an angle that suggests the camera was positioned impossibly deep within the ductwork. The image reveals a vast network of tunnels, far more extensive than any building should contain. They stretch beyond the frame, disappearing into darkness that seems to have its own depth and substance. In the center of the photograph, barely visible in the shadows, is a door. It's small, perfectly round, and it's standing open. Beyond it, I can see light, not electric light, but something warmer, more organic. The light seems to pulse with the same rhythm as the voices, as if it's the source of everything I've been experiencing. I know I have to go through that door, not because I want to, but because the choice has already been made. The voices are calling me home, to a place I've never been but somehow remember. The pebbles are warm in my hands. The mirror words are finally making sense, and the photograph shows me exactly where I need to be. I remove the vent cover one last time. The opening seems larger now, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I can smell that sweet, metallic scent stronger than ever, and I can hear the voices welcoming me back. As I pull myself up into the darkness, I realize the apartment was never my home at all. It was just a waiting room, a place to prepare for the real journey. The vent cover falls back into place below me, sealing the opening forever. In the apartment, my journal lies open on the kitchen counter, the final entry still wet with ink. They've been waiting for me to remember. I'm going home now. Story 9. It's a narrow passage, barely 10 steps long. But some nights it takes only 6. Other times I reach the end too soon, as if the walls have slid forward in my absence. I tested it, counted paces forward, then backward. The numbers don't match, not once. I hung a painting halfway to mark the center. Now it tilts slightly each time I return, as if the wall beneath it is shrinking or breathing. I think the hallway is learning how to contract. And one day, it won't let me through at all. The apartment came furnished, a stroke of luck in a tight housing market. Everything seemed perfect. Hardwood floors that gleamed under afternoon light, tall windows that framed the city skyline, and rent I could actually afford. The landlord handed me the keys with a distracted smile, mentioning only that the previous tenant had left suddenly. I should have asked why. The hallway connects my bedroom to the living room, a simple corridor lined with cream-colored walls and a single overhead light. Nothing unusual about it, except for the way it seems to shift when I'm not looking directly at it. The first time I noticed, I dismissed it as fatigue. Late nights at work tend to play tricks on tired eyes. But the sensation persisted, growing stronger with each passing day. I began measuring the distance obsessively. 12 paces from bedroom door to living room entrance. Always 12. But the feeling remained that the space was somehow compressing, folding in on itself when I turned away. I placed a small potted plant exactly at the midpoint, using a tape measure to ensure precision. The next morning, it sat closer to the living room end, though I hadn't moved it. The walls feel different now when I brush against them. They're warm, almost feverish, with a slight tremor that runs through the plaster like a pulse. I press my palm flat against the surface and count. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. The rhythm is too regular, too human. Walls shouldn't have heartbeats. I started keeping a journal, documenting each strange occurrence with scientific precision. The hallway's length varies between 8 and 14 paces, though it was originally 12. The painting I hung shifts position nightly, moving incrementally toward the bedroom door. The overhead light dims without cause, casting shadows that seemed to lean inward, narrowing the space visually before it narrows physically. Sleep became elusive. I'd lie in bed listening to the house settle, but the sounds from the hallway were wrong. Instead of the usual creaks and sighs of old wood, I heard something like whispers, soft, insistent voices speaking in a language I couldn't quite understand. When I crept to the doorway to investigate, the sounds stopped instantly, leaving only the faint scent of something floral and cloying, like funeral flowers left too long in stagnant water. I installed a motion sensor light, thinking the overhead bulb might be failing. The new light responded to movement, but sometimes it would flicker on when I was nowhere near the hallway. I'd watch from the living room as the light danced, illuminating nothing but empty space. Yet the sensor insisted something was there, moving back and forth with measured steps. The real terror began when I started finding things in the hallway that didn't belong. A child's toy block, painted red with faded letters. A single earring, tarnished silver with a pearl drop. A photograph of people I didn't recognize, their faces slightly blurred as if the camera had moved. Each item appeared overnight, placed deliberately in the center of the corridor where I couldn't miss them. I researched the building's history, searching for any clue about what might be happening. The previous tenant's name was listed as vacant in the rental records, though neighbors remembered someone living there briefly. A woman who kept to herself, who complained about noises in the walls. She left without notice, abandoning her furniture and personal belongings. The landlord claimed she'd moved suddenly for work, but his eyes wouldn't meet mine when he spoke. The hallway's contractions became more pronounced. Some nights, I'd reach the living room in just 4 paces, the walls pressing so close I could touch both sides simultaneously. Other times, the journey seemed endless, stretching beyond its physical limits, while my steps echoed in a space that should have been silent. The painting now hung at eye level, perfectly centered, though I hadn't adjusted it in weeks. I began sleeping on the living room sofa, avoiding the hallway entirely. But the dreams found me anyway. In them, I walked through an endless corridor lined with doors that opened onto more hallways, each one narrower than the last. The walls pulsed with that same rhythmic tremor, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could almost make out words, phrases in a language that felt familiar yet foreign. The breaking point came during what should have been an ordinary morning. I approached the hallway carrying my coffee, planning to retrieve a book from the bedroom. The corridor stretched before me, seemingly normal, but as I took my first step, the walls began to close. Not quickly, but with deliberate, measured movement. The space contracted around me like a living thing, forcing me to turn sideways, then pressing closer still. I dropped the coffee and pushed against the walls, but they continued their slow, inexorable advance. The overhead light flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mock my panic. The whispers returned, louder now, surrounding me with urgent voices that spoke in unison. I understood them finally, though the words made no sense. The space remembers what it holds. Panic gave way to something darker as the walls pressed against my chest, making breathing difficult. I clawed at the plaster, leaving scratches that immediately healed, as if the surface were organic rather than manufactured. The painting fell and shattered, its frame splintering against the floor, but the walls didn't stop their advance. Then, suddenly, the pressure released. The hallway snapped back to its original dimensions with an audible sigh, leaving me gasping in the center of what appeared to be a perfectly normal corridor. The broken frame had vanished, the wall unmarked by my desperate scratching. Only the spilled coffee remained as evidence of what had happened. I packed that same morning, throwing clothes into suitcases with shaking hands. The hallway watched me work, its walls humming with that familiar pulse. As I carried my bags toward the front door, I had to pass through the corridor one final time. It felt different now, victorious, satisfied. The walls seemed to smile as I hurried past. The new apartment is modern, with an open floor plan and no long hallways. But sometimes, late at night, I wake to the sound of measured footsteps in spaces that shouldn't exist. The walls of my bedroom feel warm when I touch them, and there's a faint floral scent that reminds me of funeral flowers. I've started measuring distances again, counting paces from room to room. The numbers never match twice. And yesterday, I found a small toy block on my kitchen counter, painted red with faded letters. It wasn't there when I went to bed, but it sits there now, waiting. The space remembers what it holds, and I think I brought something with me when I left. Something that's learning to contract new walls, to whisper in new corners, to make itself at home in whatever narrow passage it finds. The hallway may be gone, but the feeling remains. That sense of being watched, measured, slowly compressed by forces I cannot see or understand. I document everything now, filling notebook after notebook with observations and measurements. But the numbers keep changing, and the walls keep whispering. And somewhere in the spaces between rooms, something is learning to follow me home.